Good morning. This hearing of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Today, the Subcommittee will conduct an oversight hearing on torture and the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees, the effectiveness and consequences of enhanced interrogation. The Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Since news of the mistreatment and possible torture of detainees in U.S. custody first surfaced, Congress has debated and legislated on the subject of the legal and moral limits on interrogation tactics. We have been told, 1, it's not torture, it's only enhanced interrogation. 2, it's none of our business. 3, it's legal. 4, even if it's not legal, the President can still order it and make it legal. 5, we have to do it to save American lives. Today, I hope that we can begin to get to the bottom of these difficult and important issues. A great deal of what has gone on, despite this administration's penchant for secrecy, has become public. Methods of interrogation so appalling they sound like, and in some cases are, techniques pioneered by the Spanish Inquisition. This conduct is unworthy of the United States and its people. It is unworthy of the United States government. It places every American, especially every American in uniform around the world, at grave risk. Does betraying our values make us safer? Do we need to do these terrible things in order to survive in this dangerous world? That has been the message we have gotten subtly and not so subtly. I have been accused on more than one occasion of trying to make possible another 9/11 attack, an especially terrible slur given that thousands of my neighbors died in the World Trade Center on that day in my district. People and nations do terrible things in war, but civilized nations recognized long ago that there must be limits on their conduct even during military conflicts. The United States, historically, has been a leader in the effort to establish and enforce the laws of war and conventions against torture. Indeed, the United States Army Field Manual is an outstanding example of a modern military dedicated to observing international norms of conduct. It is a credit to our men and women in uniform that they continue to abide by these rules. It is unforgivable that some civilians here in Washington seem to think that they know better, that they need to be more brutal than our military and professional interrogators are, and that they have permission to break our laws and to break the treaties that we have signed, and to try to keep it secret, because the American people and the Congress cannot be trusted with knowing what these people know, and cannot be trusted with judging what these people have done in our name. Today we will try to get at some of the facts and look behind some of the more outlandish and extravagant claims. We have a very distinguished panel with us, and I look forward to their testimony. I yield back the balance of my time. I would now recognize our distinguished ranking minority member, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, for his opening statement.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we're here today because of an article that appeared in the New York Times. But nowhere in that entire New York Times article does it state that the confidential legal advice in question authorizes torture. The article simply describes a memo that allows what the headline characterizes as severe interrogations. On the American side of the ledger, let me be very clear, Mr. Chairman, torture is illegal. Torture is banned by various provisions of law, including the Uniform Code of Military Justice in 19 U.S.C. 893 and the 2005 Senate Amendment prohibiting the cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment of anyone in U.S. custody. In fact, the terrorist detainees at Guantanamo Bay are treated so well in their confinement that they have gained an average of 15 pounds. They have been given the best medical and dental care and the utmost in religious accommodation, including Qurans and the ability to pray 5 times a day undisturbed in the direction of Mecca. However, Mr. Chairman, terrorists make no such reciprocal accommodations, either for American warfighters or innocent American civilians. To state the obvious, terrorist acts can have severe consequences, as we saw when 3,000 American lives were suddenly, brutally, and violently taken on September 11th. Clearly, severe interrogations in some circumstances may be necessary to prevent severe consequences that involve the violent deaths of thousands of innocent Americans. In fact, aggressive but legal controlled interrogations have worked well in the past and are working now to save thousands of innocent American lives. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the driving force behind the 9/11 attacks, stayed quiet for months after his capture. The interrogators eventually reportedly used some version of what is called waterboarding on him for just 90 seconds, at which point he began to reveal information that helped authorities arrest at least 6 major terrorists, including some who were in the process of plotting the bringing down of the Brooklyn Bridge, bombing a hotel, blowing up U.S. gas stations, poisoning American water reservoirs, detonating a radioactive dirty bomb, incinerating residential high-rise buildings by igniting apartments filled with natural gas, and carrying out large-scale anthrax attacks. Yet the New York Times article seems to fault the Justice Department for, quote, preserving the broadest possible legal latitude for harsh tactics. Mr. Chairman, if there was ever a time for harsh tactics, it should be when we are using them to defend against attacks by bloodthirsty terrorists who are trying to kill and maim thousands of innocent Americans, including our families and children. The New York Times article even concedes that the tactics it characterizes as severe interrogations simply include, quote, interrogation methods used long in training our own American servicemen to withstand capture. We use these processes to train our own troops. Furthermore, these methods are used infrequently. As the administration has made clear, of the fewer than 100 terrorists who have gone through the interrogation program, fewer than a third required any special methods of questioning. The 2005 Senate amendment prohibits persons in the custody or control of the United States from being, quote, subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, which it defines as covering those acts prohibited under the 5th Amendment, the 8th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The New York Times article itself points out that, quote, relying on the Supreme Court finding that only the conduct that shocks the conscience was unconstitutional, a Justice Department legal opinion found that in some circumstances, not even waterboarding was necessarily cruel, inhuman, or degrading. If, for example, a suspect was believed to possess crucial intelligence about a planned terrorist attack, unquote. Now, we do not know whether or not the Department of Justice legal opinion actually used the example of waterboarding, but the general principle expressed by the Justice Department, alluded to in the article, is that the Supreme Court has found that in some circumstances, certain interrogation methods are not necessarily cruel, inhuman, or degrading if, for example, a suspect was believed to possess crucial intelligence about a planned terrorist attack. In such circumstances, harsh interrogation techniques would not unconstitutionally shock the conscience. The conclusions of the legal memorandum of the Department of Justice, as reported by the New York Times, were supported by none other than Senator Charles Schumer, Judge Michael McCasey's Democratic sponsor in the Senate. A Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on terror policy in June 8, 2004, is where Mr. Schumer of New York said the following at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. He said the following.
We ought to be reasonable about this. I think there are probably very few people in this room or in America who would say that torture should never, ever be used, particularly if thousands of lives are at stake. Take the hypothetical. If we knew that there was a nuclear bomb hidden in an American city, and we believed that some kind of torture, fairly severe maybe, would give us a chance of finding that bomb before it went off, my guess is most Americans and most senators, maybe all, would say do what you have to do. So it's easy to sit back in the armchair and say that torture can never be used. But when you're in the foxhole, it's a very different deal. And I think we all respect the fact that the president's in the foxhole every day.
Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Schumer's comments were true then they are true now. All that has changed is the politics of the day. Now, let me reemphasize, torture is illegal. The Congressional Research Service has also supported the conclusions of the Justice Department in a report that stated the following. Mr. Chairman, could I ask indulgence for 1.5 more minutes? The types of acts that fall within cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment may change over time and may not always be clear. Courts have recognized that circumstances often determine whether conduct shocks the conscience and violates a person's due process rights. Mr. Chairman, it seems that the administration, the senior Democrat from New York, and the Congressional Research Service all agree on the relevant principles, and yet some on this subcommittee are insisting that the Justice Department hand over its internal strategy discussions to Al-Qaeda. The Wall Street Journal pointed out in a recent editorial, the reason to keep these internal strategy discussions secret is so enemy combatants cannot use them as a resistance manual. If they know what's coming, they can psychologically prepare for it. We know Al-Qaeda training often involves its own forms of resistance training, and publicly describing the rules offers our enemies a roadmap for resistance. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, but I must say at the outset that I believe those who would challenge aspects of the current practices and procedures governing the interrogation of terrorists have an obligation to state explicitly exactly what sorts of interrogation techniques they would allow. If they cannot do that, they will have done a disservice to those who toil daily on the front lines of freedom and have to face exceedingly difficult decisions regarding how to best protect this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I now recognize the distinguished chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. This is an incredibly important hearing. I commend the chairman for bringing us together and the witnesses that are here. And I want to point out how easy it is to slip off onto both sides of this issue, as illustrated by my friend from Arizona, Trent Franks, in which he points out the unquestionable illegality of it and then cites the distinguished senior senator from New York, Mr. Chuck Schumer, who was a member of this committee before, as if his rationale makes it possible for us to have it both ways. And that's what this hearing is about, Mr. Chairman. Now, it is going to be critical for us to figure out whether this is illegal and it violates treaties, laws, we've repeated it, or not. And if it is illegal, it is impermissible. Now, it's a wonderful notion for us to sit here and speculate by using waterboarding, we'll get somebody to tell the truth. That's precisely what has already been established, is that making a person think that they're facing imminent death is going to make them tell the truth is about as it means that you don't have much military experience when you really believe that that's the case, because the military experts have already refuted that repeatedly. And it also sounds a little bit like the posturing of the nominated person for the Attorney Generalship, Michael Mukasey himself, who isn't even sure what waterboarding is. And he says he knows it when he sees it, but he has to do it on a case-by-case basis. That's what makes the discussion here in this Constitution Subcommittee absolutely critical. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to add into the record articles from The Nation magazine, Mother Jones, for the record, that deal with the debate around this important subject.
Without objection.
And I yield back the remainder of the time.
I thank the gentleman. In the interest of proceeding to our witnesses and mindful of our busy schedules, I would ask other members to submit their statements for the record. I'd also like to note the presence here of Mr. Delahunt of Massachusetts, who is a member of the full committee, but not the subcommittee, but who is the chairman of a subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee that has been dealing with this subject along with this subcommittee, and who will be my and who, along with me, will be introducing later today a bill on the subject of torture. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit opening statements for inclusion in the record. Without objection, the chair will be authorized to declare recess of the hearing at any point. We will now turn to our witnesses. As we ask questions of our witnesses, the chair will recognize members in the order of their seniority in the subcommittee, alternating between majority and minority, provided that the member is present when his or her turn arrives. Members who are not present when their turn begins will be recognized after the other members have had the opportunity to ask their questions. The chair reserves the right to accommodate a member who is unavoidably late or only able to be with us for a short time. Our first witness is Malcolm Nance. Mr. Nance is the founder and CEO of the International Anti-Terrorism Center of Excellence. He is a combat veteran who has served as a collections operator, analyst, and interrogator in naval intelligence and a specialist in anti-terrorism and survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, or SEER. Our second witness is Steve Kleinman. Mr. Kleinman has served in the U.S. Air Force on both active duty and in the reserve. He has served as a human intelligence officer. He was an interrogator and case officer during Operation Just Cause, as the chief of a joint combined interrogation team during Operation Desert Storm, and served as a senior advisor on interrogation to the commander of a Special Operations Task Force during Operation Iraqi Freedom. He currently holds the rank of colonel as the Reserve Senior Intelligence Officer at the Air Force Special Operations Command. Our third witness is Amrit Singh. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly?
Singh.
Singh, excuse me. Our third witness is Amrit Singh. Ms. Singh is a staff attorney at the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project, where she has litigated cases relating to the torture and abuse of prisoners held in U.S. custody abroad, the government's use of diplomatic assurances to return individuals to countries known to employ torture, and the indefinite and mandatory detention of non-citizens. She is counsel in the case of ACLU versus Department of Defense, litigation under the Freedom of Information Act for records concerning the treatment and detention of prisoners in Afghanistan, Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, and other locations abroad. She's a graduate of Cambridge University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. The subcommittee is grateful to her for agreeing to appear here today on very short notice. We also have an empty chair on the panel, and I want to explain for the record why the chair is empty. The subcommittee had invited V. Stuart Couch, Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, and an appellate judge of the Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals. A Marine Corps pilot and veteran prosecutor, he has special knowledge and expertise in the matters we are discussing here today. Colonel Couch was awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for his work on Guantanamo prosecutions. The citation awarded by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld described him as, quote, steady in faith, possessed by moral courage, and relentless in the pursuit of excellence, unquote. He was assigned to prosecute and let me just say that he had agreed to come today, and we were expecting his presence, but more on that in a moment. Colonel Couch was assigned to prosecute Mohamedou Old Slahi, I hope I'm getting that right, an alleged senior al-Qaeda operative who was charged with helping to assemble the Hamburg cell, which included the hijacker who piloted United Flight 175 into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. It was a case of personal importance to Colonel Couch. His old Marine buddy, Michael Rox Horrocks, had been the pilot, or the co-pilot, on Flight 175. 9 months later, Colonel Couch made what he calls the toughest decision of his military career when he refused to proceed with the Slahi prosecution because he concluded that Mrs. Slahi's incriminating statements, the core of the government's case, had been taken through torture and were therefore inadmissible under U.S. and international law. Mrs. Slahi was subjected to threats, mock executions, and beatings. On one occasion, he was shackled and blindfolded and taken for a boat ride in the waters off Guantanamo. He assumed he was going to be killed. His interrogators fabricated an official memorandum that purported to show that his mother was being transferred to Guantanamo and that officials had concerns about her safety as the only woman amid hundreds of male prisoners. These facts and more are recounted in an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal on March 31st of this year. So where is this distinguished Marine hero? The Department of Defense, and I ask unanimous consent that it appear in the record at this point, without objection. So where is this distinguished Marine hero? The Department of Defense ordered him, that's ordered in the military sense, not to testify at this hearing today. Although we have asked the Department of Defense numerous times to confirm this order and the reasons for it, we have yet to receive the courtesy of a written confirmation. The only confirmation the committee has received was a letter yesterday from Colonel Couch at 6:15 p.m. The letter reads as follows, quote, I regret to inform you that I have been advised by the Department of the Navy Office of Legislative Affairs that the Department of Defense has decided I cannot testify before the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties oversight hearing scheduled for tomorrow. I've been advised that this decision was made by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs after consultation with the Department of Defense General Counsel. The directive not to testify was communicated to the Department of the Navy Chief of Legislative Affairs, who advised me of it through official channels. Please be advised that I am willing to testify before the subcommittee in the event I am allowed to do so by the Department of Defense. I ask unanimous consent that Colonel Couch's letter appear in the record at this point. Without objection. So Colonel Couch's chair remains empty today. I find it outrageous that the administration has again chosen to stonewall an investigation into some very serious charges, and the outlandish claim that torture, or whatever you want to call it, is legitimate and in our national interest. Colonel Couch was invited to appear in his personal capacity and to discuss matters that he has already discussed at public speeches and that have already appeared in the Wall Street Journal. These are not state secrets. I'm very tired of the secrecy and stonewalling by this administration. It is disgraceful that the administration would allow Colonel Couch to make after-dinner speeches about the subject matter, to talk at length to the press about the subject matter, but prohibit him from testifying before a duly constituted committee of the Congress. It is disgraceful that the Congress and the American people must rely on leaks, lawsuits, and Freedom of Information Act requests to find out what our own government is doing. The issues before this subcommittee today could not be more serious, yet once again, when important questions need to be answered, we are told that no one has the right to question the administration. I can assure everyone that we will continue our work, that Colonel Couch will eventually be able to take a seat at the witness table. Indeed, it may very well be that we will invite the people or subpoena the people who ordered him not to testify to come here and explain why they did so. I regret that this honorable American who has served his nation with such distinction has been treated so disgracefully by this administration. I now want to turn to the witnesses who are with us today. Your written statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I would ask that each of you now summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light at your table. When one minute remains, the light will switch from green to yellow and then red when the 5 minutes are up.
Mr. Chairman.
Before we begin, it is customary for the committee to swear in its witnesses. If you could please stand and raise your right hand to take the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? I do. Thank you. Let the record you may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. You may be seated.
It's all right.
I'll recognize the distinguished ranking member at his request.
Mr. Chairman, I could have done this in my question time. I apologize, but I just wanted to ask unanimous consent to place the Wall Street Journal article explaining why Mr. Colonel Couch is not here today. He was advised by William J. Haynes at the Pentagon that he has determined that as a sitting judge and former prosecutor, it's improper for him to testify about matters still pending in the military court system, and that he was not to appear before the committee today because he is a prosecutor in ongoing cases, and if that happened in civilian life, the same situation would occur.
Without objection, the article will be part of the record, although I will point out that it's interesting that that objection is made to his testimony here, but that objection is not made to his talking about the same matters to the Wall Street Journal or to after-dinner speeches, and that a colonel who is a senior prosecutor should be judged completely able to know what he's allowed to say and what he's not allowed to say. I'm sorry. He has a rank, doesn't he? First witness is Mr. Nance.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, it is an honor to be here before you today. My name is Malcolm Wrightson Nance. I am a former member of the U.S. military intelligence community, a retired U.S. Navy Senior Chief Cryptologic Technician, Arabic interpreter. I have served honorably for 20 years. While serving my nation, I had the honor to be accepted for duty as an instructor at the U.S. Navy Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, SEER School, in North Island Naval Air Station, California. I served in the capacity as an instructor and master training specialist in wartime prisoner of war, peacetime hostile government detainee, and terrorist hostage survival programs. At SEER, one of my most serious responsibilities was to employ, supervise, or witness dramatic and highly kinetic coercive interrogation methods through hands-on live demonstrations in a simulated captive environment which inoculated our students to the experience of a high-intensity stress and duress. Some of these coercive physical techniques have been identified in the media as enhanced interrogation techniques. The most severe of those employed by SEER was waterboarding. Within the 4 SEER schools in the Joint Personnel Recovery community, the waterboard was rightly used as a demonstration tool that revealed to our students the techniques of brutal authoritarian enemies. SEER trained tens of thousands of service members of its historical use by the Nazis, the Japanese, the North Koreans, Iraq, the Soviet Union, the Khmer Rouge, and the North Vietnamese. SEER emphasized that the enemies of democracy and rule of law often ignore human rights, defy the Geneva Conventions, and have subjected our men and women to grievous physical and psychological harm. We stress that enduring these calumnies will allow our soldiers to return home with honor. The SEER community was designed over 50 years ago to show that, as a torture instrument, waterboarding is a terrifying, painful, and humiliating tool that leaves no physical scars and which can be repeatedly used as an intimidation tool. Waterboarding has the ability to make the subject answer any question with a truth, a half-truth, or outright lie in order to stop the procedure. Subjects usually resort to all 3, often in rapid sequence. Most media representations or recreations of the waterboarding are inaccurate, amateurish, and dangerous improvisations, which do not capture the true intensity of the act. Contrary to popular opinion, it is not a simulation of drowning, it is drowning. In my case, the technique was so fast and professional that I didn't know what was happening until the water entered my nose and throat. It then pushes down into the trachea and starts the process of respiratory degradation. It is an overwhelming experience that induces horror, triggers a frantic survival instincts. As the event unfolded, I was fully conscious of what was happening. I was being tortured. Proponents claim that American waterboarding is acceptable because it is done rarely, professionally, and only on truly deserving terrorists like 9/11 planner Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Media reporting revealed that tough interrogations were designed to show we had taken the gloves off. It may also have led directly to prisoner abuse and murder in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The debate surrounding waterboarding has been a lesson to a question of he said, she said politics, but I believe that some of it view it as now acceptable, and that is symptomatic of a greater problem. We must ask ourselves, has America unwittingly relinquished its place as guardian of human rights and the beacon of justice? Do we now agree that our unique form of justice, based on the concepts of fairness, honor, and the unwavering conviction that America is better than its enemies, should no longer govern our intelligence agencies? This has now been clearly called into question. On the morning of September 11th, at the green field next to the burning Pentagon, I was a witness to one of the greatest displays of heroism in our history. American men and women, both military and civilian, repeatedly and selflessly risked their lives to save those around them. At the same time, hundreds of American citizens gave their lives to save thousands in both Washington, D.C. and New York City. It was a painful day for all of us. But does the ultimate goal of protecting America require us to adopt policies that shift our mindset from righteous self-defense to covert cruelty? Does protecting America at all costs mean sacrificing the Constitution, our laws, and the Bill of Rights in order to save it? I do not believe that. The attacks of September 11th were horrific, but they did not give us the right to destroy our moral fabric as a nation or to reverse a course that for 200 years led the world towards democracy, prosperity, and guaranteed the rights of billions to live in peace. We must return to using our moral compass in the fight against al-Qaeda. Had we done so initially, we would have had greater success to stanch out terrorist activity and perhaps would have captured Osama bin Laden long ago. And the rest of my statement is in the record.
Thank you. Ms. Singh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be here today. My name is Amrit Singh. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and I'm counsel to plaintiffs in the lawsuit ACLU versus Department of Defense, a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit challenging the withholding of documents by the federal government relating to the torture and abuse of prisoners held in United States custody abroad. While we continue to litigate the improper withholding of information, the FOIA lawsuit has forced the government to publicly disclose more than 100,000 pages of its documents relating to the treatment of prisoners held in United States custody abroad. And I have personally reviewed all of these documents. Some of the key documents obtained through that litigation are collected in a book, Administration of Torture, which is available to the committee. 3 key sets of facts emerge from the FOIA documents that are collected and described in the book Administration of Torture. First, government documents demonstrate that an official interrogation policy that deviates from long-standing legal prohibitions on torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment opens the door to widespread abuse and torture. This fact is evident from a comparison of the Abu Ghraib photographs leaked to the press in April of 2004 and the interrogation directives issued by Secretary Rumsfeld for use in Guantanamo Bay in December 2002. When the photographs were published, senior administration officials insisted that the conduct depicted therein was that of rogue soldiers and that the abuse of prisoners was not a matter of policy. However, many of the Abu Ghraib photographs show the same kind of abusive methods, such as stress positions, the removal of clothing, and the exploitation of individual phobias, such as the fear of dogs, that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had earlier authorized for use on prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. Several other Abu Ghraib photographs depicted prisoners wearing women's underwear on their head and being dragged across the floor on a leash. Those were the same methods that interrogators had applied on Guantanamo prisoner Mohammed al-Qahtani in the fall of 2002. Government documents similarly show that techniques such as stress positions, prolonged isolation, sleep and light deprivation, forced nudity, and intimidation with military dogs, all of which were authorized for use at Guantanamo Bay by Secretary Rumsfeld, also came to be used by interrogators in Afghanistan. While much of the widespread abuse described in government documents reflects direct applications of authorized interrogation methods, some of this abuse is also attributable to force drift, a phenomenon described by former Navy General Counsel Alberto Mora as a tendency for the escalation of force used to extract information once an initial barrier against the improper force has been breached. By issuing directives that violated laws requiring humane prisoner treatment and declaring that the gloves were off, senior officials in the chain of command in effect gave interrogators license to apply still more abusive variations of authorized enhanced interrogation methods. And autopsy reports received through the FOIA litigation confirmed that forced drift in fact did take place. The autopsy reports showed that prisoners held in United States custody abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan were suffocated and beaten to death and subjected to torture under any definition of that term. Second, clinical descriptions of enhanced interrogation methods conceal the severity of the mental and physical damage caused by these methods. For example, in one government document, an FBI agent describes the devastating consequences of interrogations in which military personnel employed, quote, environmental manipulation, unquote, techniques. The environmental manipulation refers to the exposure to extreme temperatures. And the FBI agent observes, on a couple of occasions, I entered interview rooms to find a detainee chained hand and foot in a fetal position to the floor with no chair, food, or water. Most times they had urinated and defecated on themselves and had been left there for 18 to 24 hours or more. On one occasion, the air conditioning had been turned so far down that the temperature was so cold in the room that the barefooted detainee was shaking with cold. On another occasion, the air conditioning had been turned off, making the temperature in the unventilated room probably well over 100 degrees. The detainee was almost unconscious on the floor with a pile of hair lying next to him. He had apparently literally been pulling his own hair out throughout the night. Lawyers for Majid Khan, a Guantanamo detainee, have been barred from discussing the enhanced interrogation techniques applied on him and the torture that he was subjected to. At a minimum, Congress should seek a classified briefing with those lawyers to find out precisely what those enhanced interrogation methods entail. And finally, seasoned FBI officials documented the position that enhanced interrogation methods are not only illegal, but they are also ineffective. In fact, FBI officials repeatedly told Defense Department officials that rapport-building methods were far more effective at producing reliable intelligence. In sum, the dangers associated with employing such methods are plainly evident from the government's own documents. I therefore urge you to ensure that all federal agencies and their personnel comply with long-standing legal prohibitions on torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and to enact legislation that would extend the application of the United States Army Field Manual to agencies other than the Defense Department, including the CIA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Singh. Now, since Colonel Couch could not be with us, in lieu of his direct testimony, I will read into the record paraphrases of what of his testimony that he told the Wall Street Journal, and I will limit it to the customary 5 minutes for his testimony. When the Pentagon needed someone to prosecute a Guantanamo Bay prisoner linked to 9/11, it turned to Lieutenant Colonel V. Stewart Couch. A Marine Corps pilot and veteran prosecutor, Colonel Couch brought a personal connection to the job. His old Marine buddy, who was a co-pilot on United 175, the second plane to strike the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. But 9 months later, what he calls the toughest decision of his military career, Colonel Couch refused to proceed with the prosecution of Mr. Slahy. The reason, he concluded that Mr. Slahy's incriminating statements, the core of the government's case, had been taken through torture, rendering them inadmissible under U.S. and international law. Colonel Couch had his own misgivings. On his first visit to Guantanamo in October 2003, he recalls preparing to watch an interrogation of a detainee when he was distracted by heavy metal music. Accompanied by an escort, he saw a prisoner shackled to a cell floor, rocking back and forth, mumbling as strobe lights flashed. Two men in civilian dress shut the cell door and told Colonel Couch to move along. "Did you see that?" he asked his escort. The escort replied, "Yeah, it's approved." Colonel Couch says, "The treatment resembled the abuse he had been trained to resist if captured. He never expected Americans would be the ones employing it. The incident started keeping me up at night," he says. "I couldn't stop thinking about it." Colonel Couch says he and his case investigator, an agent detailed from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, began an under-the-table effort to find out what made Mr. Slahy break after he'd suddenly begun to testify to all kinds of things after an extended period of not speaking. Colonel Couch says he was suspicious about the sudden change and felt he needed to know all the circumstances before bringing the case to trial. It was like Hansel and Gretel following breadcrumbs, Colonel Couch says. The agent spoke to intelligence officers and others with more direct knowledge, pursued documents with details of the interrogations, and passed his findings on to the prosecutor. What emerged, Colonel Couch concluded, was torture. Initially, Mr. Slahy said he was pleased to be taken to Guantanamo. "I thought this is America, not Jordan. They're not going to beat you," he told his detention hearing. But after Mr. bin al-Shib named him as a top al-Qaeda member, "My life changed dramatically," Mr. Slahy said. Initially, Mr. Slahy denied having al-Qaeda connections, frustrating his interrogators. On May 22, 2003, an FBI interrogator said, "This was our last session. He told me that I was not going to enjoy the time to come." In the following weeks, Mr. Slahy said he was placed in isolation, subjected to extreme temperatures, beaten, and sexually humiliated. The detention board transcript states that at this point, the recording equipment began to malfunction. It summarizes Mr. Slahy's missing testimony as discussing, quote, how he was tortured while here at Gitmo by several individuals, close quote. Mr. Slahy was put under more intense interrogation. On July 17, 2003, a masked interrogator told Mr. Slahy he had dreamed of watching detainees dig a grave, according to a 2005 Pentagon report into detainee abuse at Guantanamo. The interrogator said he saw a plain pine casket with Mr. Slahy's identification number painted in orange lowered into the ground. 3 days later, the interrogator told Mr. Slahy that his family was incarcerated, the report said. On August 2nd, the interrogation chief visited the prisoner, posing as a White House representative named Navy Captain Collins, the report said. He gave the prisoner a forged memorandum indicating that Mr. Slahy's mother was being shipped to Guantanamo and that officials had concerns about her safety as the only woman amid hundreds of male prisoners, according to a person familiar with the matter. In his detention board testimony, Mrs. Slade provided further details, as did other people familiar with the matter. 2 men took a shackled, blindfolded Mrs. Slade to a boat for a journey into the waters of Guantanamo Bay. The hour-long trip apparently led Mrs. Slade to think he was going to be killed, and in fear, he urinated in his pants. After making land, 2 Arab guys, in quotes, took him away, beat him, and turned him over to a, quote, doctor who was not a regular doctor but part of the team, unquote, Mrs. Slade said. The doctor was cursing me and telling me very bad things. He gave me a lot of medication to make me sleep, Mrs. Slade said. After 2 or 3 weeks, Mrs. Slade said he broke because they said to me, either I'm going to talk or they will continue to do this. And that is some of what Colonel Couch would have testified to, but unfortunately he couldn't be here now. We have a vote on, and before we begin, I think it's a good time to recess the hearing now so the members can go vote. What? No, we amendment. We'll do the first 5 minutes of questioning. We can still do that and get in the vote. And I'll recognize, at his request, the ranking member, Mr. Franks, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate the courtesy. Mr. Chairman, I guess the first thing that I want to try to say here is to remind everyone that torture under the laws of the United States is illegal and should be illegal. And even Mr. Schumer's comments when the word torture was used, those were his words, not mine. I do not support, nor will I ever support, torture by the United States. And I think it's very important that we define those terms, and I commend the chairman for the efforts here to define those terms specifically and in practice, because it's important that we know that. The reason that I have made statements supporting severe interrogations is because I truly seek only to protect the innocent in this country from being tortured, from being killed. And it's too bad that we live in a world with the kind of evil that kneels someone down before a television camera and cuts their head off with a hacksaw while the victims scream for mercy. It is a tragedy that beggars description, and I wish it did not exist. Unfortunately, it does. And sometimes we have to take measures to protect the innocent that we do not like. And I find myself in that untenable position. And I'd ask the committee here for a little bit of diplomatic immunity, because I have to deal with a subject here that's rather difficult for me to bring up. But I find it unfortunate that sometimes the tenor of this committee hearing in this particular situation is to somehow couch the administration and Republicans in general as being for torture, and the other side being, somehow that they're trying to protect us constitutionally and otherwise. And yet, Mr. Chairman, this is the Constitution Committee. This is a committee dedicated to protecting the constitutional rights of Americans. And not once during this term have we even considered the personhood and protection of unborn children. And yet last Congress, we had a bill before the Congress that said that if torturous techniques were used to abort a child, that the mother would be offered anesthetic for the child. And most of the members of this committee that were voted on that voted against it, against allowing anesthetic for procedures that, if done to an animal, would be illegal. So in the context of this committee hearing, and this particular subject, it's kind of outrageous to me to see that somehow Republicans are suggested that we are for torture, because we are not. I wish the evil of jihadist terrorism did not exist in the world, and I would do anything to change that. But unfortunately, we face a reality where an evil ideology is dedicated to the destruction of the innocent and our way of life. And sometimes we have to do what's necessary within the bounds of human conscience to do what's necessary to stop them from torturing our citizens.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir, I would.
You just compromised your statement just then by saying first you're unequivocally against torture, and then sometimes you have to do what you have to do.
I said within the bounds of human conscience, which I believe excludes torture, Mr. Chairman, and reclaim the time. So the bottom line here is that I am sorry that sometimes we have to deal with such difficult subjects, and I'm going to go ahead and refer to one of my questions here. I think I've said what I needed to say. Mr. Kleinman, or Colonel Kleinman, do you agree or disagree with this statement? That in the event we are ever confronted with having to interrogate a detainee with knowledge of an imminent threat to millions of Americans, then the decision to depart from standard international practices must be made by the President. Do you agree or disagree with that, sir?
If I were to be an advisor on how that question would be most effectively answered as an operational advisor, I'd say it would be unnecessary to conduct our affairs in a way that's outside the boundaries. From a purely operational perspective, the sum total of my experience strongly suggests, I would submit even proves, that the legal and moral concerns are almost immaterial, because what we need to do operationally to be effective is well within the boundaries.
I appreciate the perspective. I just wanted to point out to the committee, Mr. Chairman, that was the statement made by Hillary Clinton to say how she would handle it if she were president. And I'm just suggesting here that the situation here, to draw lines between one party being for torture and another being against it are unfair distinctions. We're all trying desperately to protect the innocent in this country, I hope, and to protect the hope of human freedom in the world. And unfortunately, stopping jihadist terrorism must be part of it, and severe interrogations may be part of doing that. And we need to reject torture and do what's necessary within the bounds of human conscience to stop jihadist terrorism from torturing our citizens. And I yield.
I thank the gentleman. I would simply point out before we recess that nobody has said anything about the Republican Party with respect to torture. We have raised questions about some of the practices of the current administration. It doesn't mean that every Republican would do the same things that some of the people in this administration have done, but we are duty-bound to examine the practices of whoever the current administration is, because that's our job as an oversight committee.
Will the chair yield for one question or one brief comment? Is Senator McCain
Yes.
a Republican?
I believe Senator McCain is a Republican,
you,
and he has certainly taken some interesting positions. Mr. Nance, waterboarding has often been described in this debate as simulated drowning, which makes it sound like it isn't particularly severe and doesn't have long-term effects. In your testimony, you said it's actual drowning. Do you agree with the characterization? I mean, how would you characterize waterboarding? As actual drowning, as simulated drowning, as very severe? I mean, as torture, as in the gray area? Talk about it.
Well, I characterize that waterboarding is misnamed. It should not be called waterboarding. That's just the device that we use and that torturers have used throughout history. It should be called the drowning torture, and has been called the drowning torture in the past. Waterboarding is a process in which we introduce quantities of water into the sinus passage, into the throat, down into the esophagus, past the trachea, and then with enough response by you choking, we will overcome your gag reflex and water over very large quantities. If I can just say, I heard that earlier that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded for 90 seconds. I estimate by our standards, which is very rigid, we have very rigid control standards about how it's done. I won't get into that because it's classified. That's approximately 9 cups or 79 ounces of water, 1.2 gallons.
And how much of that would go into him as opposed to splashing off his face?
30 to 40%. But that depends on whether they give him an opportunity to ask any questions. And I would think on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they probably wouldn't. That is going into the system, and it is degrading his respiratory system, and that's why we have very strict controls and medical controls to ensure that the person doesn't go into respiratory arrest.
When you say you have very strict controls, you're talking about when you're training or when they're actually doing this to somebody?
I'm sorry, I can only speak to the training.
Okay.
I understand, but I don't have it for fact because it's probably a classified special access program, and at some future point I'm sure you'll learn. But I understand that the controls that are being used are our controls from the SEER community, which means that they're very rigid, which means a medical team, a medical doctor who is watching, who is actually controlling the rate of the process.
But this is actual water going into the victim, into the person's lungs?
Oh, yes, sir.
And now, if this was done for, let's say, 90 seconds, the example used by my colleague, Mr. Frankston, I think you mentioned for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, is that severe? Is that torture? Is that 90 seconds isn't much? I mean, how bad is 90 seconds?
Well, I think I have to couch that with the concept that when we do it in simulated training, it's what we call stress inoculation. And the person knows that this is a training environment and they're being exposed to what a totalitarian nation would do. When Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or some unwitting individual, whether it be an innocent person or an extremely guilty person or whatever you, that person has no idea what is about to happen to them.
So it's worse.
Oh, it's far worse.
Thank you. Now, let me ask you another question.
Sure.
We've been told repeatedly, and the administration has said repeatedly, it cannot, what we do isn't torture. We can't tell you what we do because that's classified, and it's classified because we cannot tell the enemy, Al-Qaeda, etc., what interrogation techniques they will be exposed to because they might train their people. And so exactly what interrogation techniques we will use must remain classified. Now, we have released hundreds of people that have been previously detained or imprisoned. Do you believe, is there any reason to believe that they haven't already shared the exact details of how they were interrogated or treated? In other words, is there any reason to believe that this isn't already known, what we do, that what we do isn't already known to Al-Qaeda because of the people who've been released and have gone through this?
That's an excellent question because I live between the United States and in the United Arab Emirates. I speak Arabic and I watch local programming. Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Arabiya and other programs that come from the Middle East, including our own the Hurra TV out of Iraq, have constantly playing interviews, recreations of prisoners who have been released from Guantanamo Bay, who've been released from Camp Bucca, released from Abu Ghraib.
So they're saying this is what the Americans do.
In great detail. As a matter of fact, I learned a few details that were I thought at that time classified from our procedures from SEER by watching an Al Jazeera program on a prisoner talk about the exact techniques he was.
So you believe that when the administration says they cannot tell us in open testimony, they cannot discuss the techniques that we use, lest it be known to Al-Qaeda, that it's already known to Al-Qaeda?
I believe it's known to Al-Qaeda, but I believe also...
Did you say known or unknown?
I believe it is known to Al-Qaeda, but I also believe that there's no need in having to completely confirm everything. So there is, I believe there's a little validity to that, but right now the only people that appear to be in the dark is the American people.
Thank you. Mr. Kleinman, Colonel Kleinman, excuse me. I'm sure you're familiar with the Army Field Manual.
Yes, sir. I'm very
Okay.
much so.
Then let me ask you a question. I need you to set aside for a minute any moral or legal concerns and also any other limits that might be imposed by the Army Field Manual. If you were in a position where you knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever know what you had done, and you knew that the intelligence you needed to get was of urgent value, is there anything that you would, could, or should do that would go beyond what's permitted in the Army Field Manual?
Absolutely not, sir. Absolutely not. It's the wonderful point we're in, and I would like to try to expand on that if I may.
Please.
Moral, legal, and operational confluence all ends in one very narrow circle, and that is what we need to do to adhere to legal concerns, what we need to do as a nation that would be morally correct, and what I would need to do as an operator all falls in that same circle. There's not an approach, there's not a strategy, there's not a treatment that would even come close to violating Geneva Convention guidelines or the Constitution of the United States, and certainly not the field manual on interrogation. It's, we talk about rapport, but rapport is a very inexact term. There's a lot more to it. But fundamentally, to answer your question directly, that I would not need to do anything that would be prohibited by the field manual and still be very, very effective.
So would you support extending the Army Field Manual standards on interrogations, which the law now limits the Defense Department to? The law now says that the Defense Department cannot do anything in interrogations beyond the Army Field Manual. Would you think it a good idea? Would you support extending this to all government agencies, including the CIA?
I believe, sir, that would be a good first step, but only a first step.
Why would it not be adequate?
Because
what further should be done?
The Army Field Manual reflects a lack of science when it comes to interrogation. It doesn't reflect cutting-edge understanding of human behavior. It doesn't understand the unique cultural nuance of interrogation. It is really a very simplified form. What we understand and what we're capable of doing in terms of interrogation effectively, that again would be well within the spirit and letter of any overriding regulation, it far exceeds what's in the field manual. Having looked at the archives, really the field manual is a summation of after-action reports put together of tactical interrogations in World War II, with no further embellishment, no advancement in the last 60 years. So when I say first step, it'd be excellent because it sets a standard that we can all abide by and still be operationally effective. But the second step is to direct that the intelligence community writ large take further steps to professionalize this discipline, to identify what it is that we don't know, what works well. We don't even have a standard for what is effective.
Okay. I thank you. I'll now recognize the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Mr. Conyers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask each of you who have made, by the way, excellent explanations of the phenomenon that we're dealing with. Can we get on the record, is there anything that could be construed as effective in waterboarding or coercive interrogation or torture in trying to elicit intelligence information? What kind of reliability does your experience in the record show in that regard?
I can only, again, speak to the types of training environments that we have. Anything else I discuss would be of a classified nature. However, with that experience, it is clear that in a coercive environment, the purpose of a resistor, and we've trained thousands of them, the purpose of a resistor is to stop the coercion, is to stop the pain of the interrogation. That person will do anything once pushed past their limit to resist. And that means when pain is applied, they will open their mouths. What comes out, we have always trained, is completely and totally unreliable. You have to have a very large data set to cross-correlate all of that information. It may be a truth, a half-truth, or a complete lie, and again, or a combination of all of the above.
Ms. Singh, do you have an impression about a response for my question? Press your mic.
Certainly. The documents the ACLU has received under the Freedom of Information Act demonstrate that FBI officials who were stationed at Guantanamo Bay, who were closely involved in observing the use of sear methods and other harsh interrogation methods as offensive techniques. These FBI officials were of the opinion that those methods were not producing reliable intelligence. And that appears again and again in the documents. In fact, the FBI was so concerned about the harsh methods that the Defense Department was employing on Guantanamo prisoners that it decided to record its objections on paper. There's a May 2003 electronic communication that the FBI specifically put on the record in order to demonstrate that it specifically objected to Defense Department methods, not only because they were illegal, but also because they were ineffective.
Thank you so much. Colonel Kleiman, how do you weigh in on this question?
It's an excellent question, sir, and let me characterize it this way. There's two objectives that one can achieve in an interrogation. One is to win compliance, the other is to win cooperation. Compliance is forcing somebody to do something that they would not normally want to do. And in some cases, it means against their own interests. North Korea, North Vietnamese, for instance, having a POW admit to dropping chemical weapons on civilian populations, which we knew were not true, but through torture was forced to do that. That's misinformation. That's the antithesis of what we seek as intelligence officers. We want intelligence, information of intelligence value. The second objective is winning their cooperation to various degrees, where they're able to provide reliable information, where I'm able to explore the full range of their knowledgeability, not just exploring areas that I suspect they know about, but in my personal experience, I've often found that a source knows far more than we could have possibly suspected. And without his cooperation, I can't come close to getting there.
Do we have any information, witnesses, that we outsource torture to private contractors? Here we are in Iraq with more private military, more private people working with the Army of Occupation than there is Army. And so I'm trying to find out to what extent is that condoned by these private contractors?
Well, sir, I think that addresses a larger issue about interrogation. Interrogation has been kind of the, so to speak, the bastard stepchild of human intelligence. Having been a human intelligence officer for years doing the full spectrum, we often didn't look as interrogators as truly humanitors. I had a colonel when I was on duty.
What did you call? What was
I'm sorry, human
intelligence.
a human intelligence officer.
Okay.
Forgive me for the vernacular there.
All right.
I had a colonel when I was on active duty, and I was still a captain, who once told me that interrogation would be irrelevant in the 21st century because we'd be able to satisfy our intelligence needs through technology, or the nature of combat would be so violent there'd be nobody to interrogate. We know now that not to be true, but we still have 18, 19, 20-year-olds talking to people who have advanced degrees, who are comfortable moving through multiple cultures, speak various languages, and understand American culture far better than we understand them. I'm 50 years old. I've studied interrogation for over 25 years, and there's still more I could learn about it.
Just let me close with this, Mr. Chairman, if I can, because Naomi Klein in The Nation has raised the question that the admission that the embrace of torture by U.S. officials long predates the Bush administration and has in fact been integral to U.S. foreign policy since the Vietnam War. Do you have any opinion on that, Ms. Singh?
I'm not in a position to comment on the basis of the documentary record that the ACLU has obtained through the FOIA on that particular issue.
Well, these are publications. I've got a bit of literature here that shows, we go back to water torture in the goes back thousands and thousands of years, but nobody talks about what was being done with it. For example, just since World War II, in all the military excursions and expeditions we've been on. What do you think, Colonel and Mr. Nance?
Here's the heart of the problem we have with interrogation is our lack of progress, our lack of bringing up, I call it the acme of skill within human intelligence. That means we need to, it's one of the most important, most difficult activities that an operations officer can undertake. To leave it to people with limited life experience, to leave it to contractors, to dumb it down, so to speak, is going to be wholly ineffective.
Mr. Nance, did you want to comment before the chairman closes us down?
Yes, sir. I think that as a whole, I believe that until recently we've seen only what I would call uncontrolled field expedient interrogations, which may have been done in Latin America and other environments.
Meaning that someone local decided to do something that wasn't approved
Yes.
or ordered from higher up?
Yes, sir. And I'm sure the Colonel can speak more to the experiences of the human intelligence field as it's done at the company, battalion, and division level. However, we can't say that it wasn't done, as we saw in the Washington Post article, which showed that field expedient interrogation being carried out in Vietnam. These are things that require discipline within the ranks, which require a very experienced and honorable NCO Corps and officer corps, which listens to their NCO Corps. Those things will happen on the battlefield. However, what we're seeing now is a systematic process, and I don't believe that that is the way that the system is supposed to work.
Thank you so
Would
much.
the gentleman yield? Mr. Conyers?
Of course.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And in response to your question about the use of outsourcing torture, I'm forgetful as to whether you were present at the hearing that we conducted together, both myself and Mr. Nadler, as joint committees.
I was only there for part of it.
Well, I think I'm not misstating to say that in the case of Mahir Ara, a Canadian, he was detained and sent by our government over his objections and without informing Canadian authorities to Syria, with a noted record of torture, particularly in areas of interrogation.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Someone from Alabama will
Alabama,
respond to the inquiry.
Sorry. I always do that.
I'll wait for Mr. Nance to go off the phone. I actually had a question for Mr. Nance. So I didn't want to. Right. No, he's trying to worry about his flight, so that doesn't come out of my time. Let me, because we do have a series of votes going on, and the chair wants to make sure that all of us who are here get a chance to ask questions. Let me briefly begin, Mr. Nance, with you and just tick off a few factual points. You testified in some detail about the graphic nature of what's called waterboarding and about the very invasive nature of it in a controlled setting. If waterboarding is done the wrong way, could it kill somebody?
Yes, sir. It could quite easily kill some of them.
If waterboarding was done the wrong way, meaning if it were misadministered, could it cause someone to have a seizure?
That's possible, sir. It could force them to go into respiratory arrest. I couldn't answer.
Also cause brain damage if done the wrong way?
Yes, sir, of course.
And I make that point because obviously if waterboarding happens in the adrenaline pump setting of a real interrogation, if waterboarding happened in the context of an environment where there really was an effort to extract information as opposed to a simulated practice technique, it strikes me that there is a significant quantifiable risk that it could cause a loss of human life, which frankly does distinguish it from a variety of other coercive techniques. So that point needs to be made. I want to make another observation and get the panel's response to it. In my experience, and I spent some time as a federal prosecutor, I spent some time as a criminal defense lawyer, and while I certainly have not dealt with these kinds of legal standards around interrogation in the context of terrorist events, I certainly have dealt with the constitutional standards that exist with respect to the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Eighth Amendment. Earlier, the ranking member was making some observations, and the chair was making observations about the importance of having a codified legal standard that defines what torture is. Let me talk about why it's significant to have that and why I think the administration made a major error in resisting it. In my experience, wherever the legal standard sits, day in, day out conduct by law enforcement officers often falls short of that. If you have a pristine legal standard, there are day in, day out abuses. So it stands to reason if you lower the legal standard or make the legal standard more imprecise, that you will also have a lowering of the bar of conduct. Ms. Singh, you're nodding your head. I take it you agree with that?
Absolutely, and documents that we reference in our book and the FOIA documents confirm that Navy General Counsel Alberto Mora referred to this phenomenon as force drift. And once there's no longer a bright line rule, that gives personnel the impression that they have a license to do anything. And in fact, we have one document that's also included it's mentioned in my written testimony. It describes the homicide death of an Iraqi general in Iraq. The Iraqi general was asphyxiated to death. The autopsy report classifies the death as a homicide death, and the military interrogator who was reprimanded for the death defended the use of asphyxiation as a SEER method, as a close confinement method, and said it can be very effective. And this is a perfect example of how once you deviate from long-established prohibitions on torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, it can just open the door to extreme versions of torture.
So an administration that is resistant to defining torture is implicitly encouraging some level of abuse, isn't it?
Certainly.
Last observation I want to make, given the time constraints, this is a point that needs to be made also. I certainly understand the observation I suspect Mr. Frank might make that Al-Qaeda doesn't play by any set of rules anyway, so having a rule standard that applies to them may be inapplicable. But I suspect that someday, somewhere, America, or more likely one of our allies, such as Israel, will find itself in competition with a conventional military, whether it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or in Israel's case, perhaps the Syrian military, or some paramilitary entity like Hezbollah. So I want the panel to comment on this last proposition. If the United States has set a pattern of torture-like conduct or conduct that is clearly, obviously torture, does it not create an incentive for an Iranian Revolutionary Guard or some other military around the world to engage in the same kind of conduct with respect to an American soldier or an Israeli soldier?
I'd like to address that. I don't think that it creates an incentive, sir. I think it creates a guarantee. I believe that we have given them and will give them a legal standard to employ enhanced interrogation techniques, not torture, to American service members should they be captured in the future. You can only do so much preparation of members of the armed forces, but they have to believe that there's something out there which is going to protect them. And I think it would be quite devastating if they were to find that our own definitions would be applied to them in captivity by other nations.
Mr. Kleinman, do you and Ms. Singh agree with that briefly?
Yes, sir. I concur with Mr. Nance's observation. I think I would characterize it this way, that if we lower the standard of in the manner in which we handle, we treat detainees, then we create circumstances where others can do that to our servicemen and women with impunity.
Or to our allies, servicemen and women.
Or to our allied. Yes, sir. That's an important distinction as well.
Ms. Singh, do you concur?
I would concur.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nance, does anybody in the world outside of the United States think that waterboarding is not torture?
Not as far as I know, sir.
Now, the definition of torture, as it's said in press conferences with this administration, is somewhat circular. We do not torture if we did it, therefore what we did was not torture. How does what you understand the administration definition to be differ from the definition in the Geneva Convention?
I can't speak to the definition of torture in the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention Article 17 states that a prisoner can only be asked certain questions and cannot be done in a coercive environment.
Colonel Kleinman, can you answer the question? How the articulated definition of torture differs from what the Geneva Convention directs?
Yes, sir. I believe I can. Let me answer that from an operator's perspective. It doesn't enjoy the distance or the legal nuance. The question of determining what is torture, some people think that is the application of severe pain as opposed to moderate or light pain, is a exceedingly imprecise calculation that is beyond the ability of any interrogator. So I have defaulted to the idea that the implication or the application of any force, whether it be psychological, physical, or emotional, is beyond the standard of the Geneva Convention.
Is a detectable physical injury a necessary element of torture?
Absolutely not.
Now, advocates have suggested there's a possibility that someday we might have a situation where torture might get information that would save some lives. Are you aware of any situation where that's actually occurred, Colonel?
No, sir, I'm not.
The gentleman from Alabama mentioned the effect that being known as a nation that tortures would have on our own troops. If we're known as a nation that tortures people, would that increase or decrease the chance it would be a target of terrorism?
I believe that would increase our status or the size of the target writ large on this nation.
Torture is a crime. Who is subject to the criminal penalties in torture? Is it just the person that does the torture, or can the officers that order it also be subject to criminal prosecution?
The answer to that, the correct answer is that the officers in the chain of command who ordered that are the primary responsible party. But anybody who is party to it, condones it, supports it, enables it, or affects it is also guilty.
How far up the chain of command can you go?
That would be a legal nuance that I think I would rather defer to somebody better prepared to answer that. But I know as a colonel in the United States Air Force, I would take responsibility for anybody under my command that conducted themselves in that manner.
Ms. Singh, is there anything that happened at Abu Ghraib prison that would be considered torture by this administration's definition?
I would say that under definitions enacted in the Detainee Treatment Act and the Military Commissions Act, what happened at Abu Ghraib amounted to torture. It amounted to the application of combinations of enhanced interrogation methods such as stress positions, intimidation with military working dogs, prolonged isolation, removal of clothing, and Navy General Counsel Alberto Mora has specifically commented on how not only the combination of these techniques, but also these individual techniques themselves can amount to torture.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'll take 5 minutes. I just actually have one question. Is the term torture, is there some worldwide definition of it? I noticed Mr. Nance said that the Geneva Convention doesn't really define it. I'm trying to figure out whether there's somewhere I can go and look at an articulated written definition of torture, or whether as the administration would have us believe, and perhaps Mr. Frank, based on what I was hearing him say, it's kind of like pornography. You don't, you can't define it, but you know it when you see it, and therefore it is in the eye of the beholder. I guess that's what I'm trying to get my arms around. Can the three of you kind of respond to that? And that's really the only question I have, because as long as it's not defined, if it is subject to the perception of the beholder, I don't know how we get beyond the point that we're at now with the administration.
Well, as to the first part of your question, the Convention Against Torture, which was signed and ratified by the United States and then implemented into domestic legislation, defines the implementing legislation defines torture as severe mental or physical pain or suffering. So it does not, the statute that implements the Convention Against Torture does not specifically list particular acts that amount to torture, but I believe that that standard certainly is instructive for informing the committee as to what kinds of methods could cause severe physical or mental pain and suffering. And as to whether torture is torture in the eye, torture is identified as torture in the eye of the beholder, I think there may be some truth to that, but certainly the logical implication would be that you must then have the information that the beholder has at a minimum, in addition to the information that the person who's being tortured has about what it feels like to be tortured. And I believe that the committee has heard testimony to that effect.
I think, sir, let me put it this way. Having seen coercive techniques being used, having stopped them, having been present, I think I'm quite sure, and I think Mr. Nance would agree with me, if a law were enacted that required 5 members of the executive branch and 5 members of the legislative branch, appointed or elected, to be present during any time we use torture or severe interrogation or enhanced interrogation, what term you want to use, and they had to watch that, be present and experience it even vicariously, I think any discussion about the use of those methods would cease immediately.
I'd like to make one comment, which
At that, I take it would be kind of a collective, you know it if you see it.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
I can't speak to the definition with the level of preciseness that you might have asked the question. However, knowing who I am and knowing what we as members of the armed forces and the people who serve this country know, I believe that we do have a pretty precise moral compass within us. And I believe that simple things, and we're not talking about the proverbial withholding of Twinkies or your coffee in the morning, we're talking about acts and calumnies and things which are inflicted upon a human being, which even if they are our enemies, would overcome our sense of righteousness or justice and would force us to look away for that moment. I believe once you get to that point, you're at torture. I've seen it. I've lived in the Middle East, operated in the Middle East my whole life, and served this nation well in that regard. And I've met people who have been tortured, and I know it when I see it. And my moral compass is quite straight on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And we have with us the gentleman from Massachusetts who is a member of the full committee, not of the subcommittee, who co-chaired a hearing with this subcommittee, and who was asked for the courtesy of asking questions and without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I'm afraid I have to, at the request of the ranking member, I respectfully object to the participation of a non-subcommittee member. House rules provide for the participation in hearings only by members of that committee or subcommittee.
He is a member of the committee.
He's not a member of the subcommittee, Mr. Chairman. House Rule 11 states that each committee shall apply the 5-minute rule during the questioning of witnesses in a hearing until such time as each member of the committee who desires has had an opportunity to question.
Very well. The committee will now go into its second round of questioning, and if Mr. Delahunt will tell me, I will ask the questions for him. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes.
I would ask the chair of the committee, and I understand the predicament that the ranking member finds himself in, and I know him to be a man of integrity and a fair man. I think that the practice by the minority in this case is not conducive to healthy discourse on this and other issues. But I would ask the chair, if the chair would pose to Mr. Nance, who indicated that he had observed.
I'll ask. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. My question is to Colonel Kleiman and Mr. Nance. I have two questions, one at a time. If intelligence professionals such as the two of you recognize that torture or enhanced interrogation techniques, whatever you want to call it, are ineffective, why are we doing it? Why does the administration want to forgetting the question of whether it's torture or enhanced interrogation techniques, if these techniques beyond the Army Field Manual are not necessary and they're ineffective, why is the administration, why does anybody want to do this?
Sir, the comments made earlier by Congressman Franks, his concern resonates with me, and I'm sure with Mr. Nance. His concern for the safety and security of the American people is foremost on his mind. But I would respectfully submit that the method to do it, the method to collect the information, the intelligence we need to protect the American people, needs to be pursued in a completely different fashion. It is very unfortunate that individuals, even at the highest levels of this government, are more informed about interrogation from a television show such as 24 or a detective series or something they've seen on TV.
So are you saying basically, I mean, are you saying basically that people in the upper reaches of government are simply overruling the intelligence professionals because they think, although they may be wrong, they think it's an effective way to do it? Is that what your testimony is?
Yes, sir. My experience talking to people who are experienced interrogators, with very, very few exceptions, they believe that heavy pressure, coercion, enhanced techniques, so forth, are ineffective.
Well, and again, my question is, if that being the case, since the interrogators, excuse me, professionals believe that this is ineffective, why are we doing it? And your answer is basically that people in high reaches of government who are not personally familiar with this have a belief from other sources that it is effective and give instructions in accordance with that belief?
That would be my take on that, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Nance.
I agree with that assessment in its entirety, sir. What we have is we have senior decision makers who are not looking at the body of evidence. We're not looking at the corporate memory and information that's held within, certainly on the colonel side, the human intelligence side, and technically they're doing a form of what we call jokingly amongst the chiefs, Tom Clancy procedures. They have chosen their procedures from popular media, and they have thought that it works in the book, therefore it must work in real life.
And issue instructions accordingly.
Aye.
Thank you. And let me ask you one further question, both of you. The various techniques we've been talking about, the various techniques that you know to be used or that you have heard are being used from waterboarding on down, what we are told is enhanced interrogation techniques. Are some of these techniques torture? I think both of you said that waterboarding is torture. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think torture, again, in this instance, depending on the technique, it's a question of intent, duration, and effect once you've executed that procedure on that person. If you take a cup of coffee and accidentally spill it on yourself, it's an accident. You take a cup of coffee and you pour it into the eyes or nostrils or hand of a person who's your prisoner, that's torture. So therefore, something as simple as what we would call a stress position, which is a person posing in one way. Once it makes that lactic acid build up in your thigh muscles, you can make any man scream. Do that repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, and you've taken a simple pose and turned it into a torture.
And these are things that the United States at present does or has done in recent years and has been labeled not to be torture?
I'm not privy to whether those actual techniques are used in the Special Access Program.
Colonel Kleiman?
Sir, I would characterize torture as an activity that causes somebody to act against their interests based on physical, psychological, or emotional pressure rather than a thoughtful decision-making dynamic. So, and have I seen what I would describe as torture? Yes, sir. Have I stopped it? Yes, sir. And we have this Zimbardo potential out there. Even in this room, it'd be surprising. There's a small percentage of people who, given absolute power, will do the most horrific things. And that's why we do need standards and why we do need legislation to cover
which leads to my final question. One of my colleagues asked about torture standards and concerns about torture or what is torture being in the eyes of the beholder. But the Army Field Manual does prohibit specific acts. Prohibits waterboarding, prohibits hypothermia and overheating. It prohibits mock executions, among other things. So your testimony is that the Army Field Manual, we know the Army Field Manual makes certain standards clear. And is your testimony, both you and Mr. Nance, that our standards ought to be clear and that the torture is not in the eyes of the beholder, but that we ought to either use the Army Field Manual or some other more strict, because I think you said it should be updated version?
Yes, sir. The reason it says that is because it's an intelligence manual. It is teaching interrogators how to collect reliable intelligence, not how to win compliance or force people to do things such as make propaganda. It doesn't wish to address anybody's moral compass or even an in-depth legal tome about it. It is just simply operationally, is it effective or not? And torture is not an effective way of getting intelligence. That's why it's outlawed.